Back in the 1970s, most American families lived with less technology, less convenience, less noise, and yet a lot of people still remember those years as feeling calmer, happier, and more real than life does now. Kids were outside for hours, families ate together, neighbors talked. Even an ordinary day had a rhythm that feels almost forgotten today. So what was it about everyday life in the 1970s that made it feel so much better? In the 1970s, mornings in most American homes had a rhythm you could almost set a clock by. Coffee brewing in the kitchen, toast popping up, a newspaper opened across the table, and if you grew up then, you probably remember that soft crackle of the pages before the day fully began. Back then, the daily paper was still a regular part of life, and breakfast at home was far more common than it is now. Families were not waking up to phones, alerts, and everyone already rushing in different directions. For a little while, the whole house was still together. Kids ate cereal or eggs before school. Adults drank coffee and talked about the day ahead. The house was awake, but it was still calm. Nobody thought of that as something special. It was simply normal life. But maybe that quiet start was one reason the rest of the day felt a little steadier too. And once breakfast was over, the front door opened and everything moved outside. Once breakfast was over, the whole day opened up. Kids in the 1970s did not need a playdate, a screen, or a schedule to stay busy. They already had a neighborhood full of things to do. Bikes were everywhere. Baseball started in the street. Someone dragged out a skateboard. Someone else was already climbing a tree or building a fort, and that was only the everyday part of it. By the weekend, there were even more things kids looked forward to, and we'll come back to that a little later. Back then, getting kids to come inside was half the battle. Now it often feels like the battle is getting them to go outside at all. In those years, children moved far more in a normal day than most kids do now. Many of them covered several miles without even thinking about it, just walking to school, riding bikes, and running from one house to the next. Nobody thought of it as fitness. It was simply childhood. There were no phones buzzing in their pockets, and no parents tracking every step. On hot days, somebody turned on the garden hose, and a quick drink from it felt perfectly normal. By the time the streetlights came on, kids had already spent hours outside talking, moving, exploring, arguing, laughing, and figuring things out on their own. Looking back, that kind of freedom did more than fill the day. It helped kids stay active, social, confident, and surprisingly independent without anyone even calling it that. Back then, the neighborhood was part of everyday life in a way that feels rare now. Front porches were used, screen doors slammed all day, lawnmowers hummed in the distance, and somebody always seemed to have a radio playing from the garage. Adults were outside too, and that made a real difference. They washed the car, cut the grass, talked across a fence, and kept an eye on the block. Because people spent more time outside, they usually knew the families living around them. Kids drifted from yard to yard, and most parents usually knew exactly whose porch or backyard they had ended up in. People did not need a phone to keep up with each other. They saw each other every day. They talked face to face. Now it is easier than ever to text or call, but it often feels less personal. Back then, even a simple afternoon felt full of movement, voices, and familiar faces. And by the time dinner started cooking, you could feel the whole neighborhood settling into the evening. In a lot of American homes, dinner still meant the family ended up in the same place at the same time. Plates on the table, someone asking how your day went, someone else talking about work or school. And before you even sat down, you could usually smell dinner coming from the kitchen, potatoes being peeled, meat browning on the stove, something warm cooking while the day outside slowly started winding down. In the 1970s, food was simply less everywhere than it is now. There were fewer snack aisles, fewer oversized portions, fewer giant soft drinks, and no apps delivering anything you wanted straight to the front door. Even soft drinks were much smaller. A large Coca-Cola decades earlier was just over 6 ounces. And by today's standards, even a regular meal in the 70s often looked modest. Maybe that was one reason so many people stayed leaner without thinking much about it. Meals still had a time and a place. People were not snacking in the car, grazing all evening, or eating in 3 different rooms. Dinner started in the kitchen, ended at the table, and gave the whole evening a rhythm that feels rare now. Evenings in the 1970s knew how to end. Most homes had one television, a few channels, and a night that naturally slowed down. Families watched the same shows together. Kids sat on the floor in their pajamas. And late at night, many Americans still heard that familiar line on TV.
It's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are?
If you were there, you know that line was part of the night. It meant kids were supposed to be home, the day was winding down, and before long, the whole house would get quiet. The evening did not stretch on with phones, streaming, and endless distractions. It came to a close, and maybe that was one reason so many people slept more deeply than they do now, and did not seem to have the same sleep problems that are so common today. And then came Saturday morning, which for a lot of kids felt like its own little event every single week. They looked forward to cartoons all week long, got up early on purpose, poured a bowl of cereal, and claimed their spot in front of the TV before anyone else did. That was part of what made it feel special. You could not watch it whenever you wanted. You had to wait for it. Later on, families piled into the station wagon for a trip to Sears, Kmart, the mall, or a few errands that somehow still felt like going somewhere. Even simple weekends felt different then, and that is something a lot of people still miss. Of course, the 1970s were not perfect. No decade ever is. But when people talk about the good old days, they are usually not saying life had no problems. They are talking about how everyday life felt while it was happening. A normal day had a rhythm that made sense. Morning felt like morning. Evening felt like evening. Weekends felt different from weekdays. Kids were not always inside. Adults were not always distracted. Families did not have to plan every moment just to spend time together. A lot of what people miss now used to be built right into daily life. Today, life is faster, easier, and more convenient in almost every way. You can reach anyone in seconds. You can order almost anything without leaving home. You can watch whatever you want, whenever you want. And yet, a lot of people still feel rushed, distracted, and strangely disconnected. Maybe that is why so many still look back on the 1970s with warmth. Not because everything was better, but because ordinary life often felt steadier, calmer, and more real. People were not trying to slow down. Life was already slower. And maybe that is the real reason those years still stay with people. We had less, but somehow it felt like more. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to share in the comments what you miss most and what part of life back then still stays with you today. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to support Memory Trails by subscribing.